Good to have you with us on Al Jazeera. I'm Elizabeth Puranam with a reminder of our top stories. Nuclear-related sanctions against Iran have been lifted after the International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed Tehran's compliance with the nuclear deal signed last year. That deal coincides with the release of 5 Iranian Americans, including the Washington Post reporter Jason Rezaian, in a prisoner swap. He'd been convicted of espionage and other offences last year. And security forces have rescued at least 150 people who were taken hostage in Burkina Faso. The attack on a hotel in Ouagadougou killed at least 28 people, including many foreigners. Let's get more on our top story now, the lifting of economic sanctions on Iran. Here's how the end of US sanctions will work in practice. So most US companies will still be banned from trading with Iran, but investors from many other parts of the world will be able to do business there. That means Iran's petrochemical industry can expect a big influx of global cash. It can also sell its oil around the world, with a few exceptions. Big oil firms like Shell and BP have been in talks with Iran for months now. Iran's financial and automotive sectors are now open for global business, but not from the US. Interestingly, US firms, along with the rest of the world, are now allowed to sell commercial aircraft and spare parts to Iran. And as well as oil, Iran is now able to sell carpets, caviar, pistachios and other food worldwide, including to the US. Well, for more on this, let's go to Farhad Alavi. He's a lawyer who focuses on international business and sanctions. He's joining us live from Washington, D.C. It's very good to have you with us on Al Jazeera. So just to be clear, not all US sanctions are going to be lifted, just the nuclear-related ones.
Exactly. If you remember, Secretary Kerry mentioned the exact same terminology, nuclear-related sanctions. The U.S. has had sanctions predating those nuclear sanctions for well over a decade before. So the vast majority of U.S. laws prohibiting U.S. companies and individuals from dealing with Iran will remain in place. Now, naturally, there are some exceptions, like the sale of most foods or medical devices or agricultural commodities, and now aircraft and related services. But most goods and services will still be off limits for us here in the United States.
And as we mentioned, the US isn't removing sanctions on US persons or businesses that want to deal with Iran, but third parties. Why is that, and could we see that change?
Right. Well, the sanctions that are on third parties were sanctions that came about because of the nuclear file from the United States. It was a way of the United States leveraging its economic influence in the world by telling third country companies and individuals that if you deal with Iran in certain areas, you should expect to be barred off or at least limited in your activities in the United States. Those were a direct result of the nuclear program. The U.S. sanctions that limit U.S. companies and individuals from dealing with Iran came into place much before that, in the mid-90s by President Clinton. And those were for Iran's alleged support of terrorism, its human rights violations, and that's why those laws are in effect. And this also shows that this was not really a grand bargain between the United States and Iran, but rather a narrow agreement on the Iranian nuclear file. Therefore, the U.S. still has its other grievances, and relations obviously have not been restored yet.
How much of a difference then will the lifting of nuclear-related sanctions and the resumption of trade make to Iran's economy? You know, it's suffering from high unemployment, hyperinflation.
Sure. Well, the United States is one country out of many that have in the past traded with Iran, and the U.S. and Iran will effectively be able to trade with much of the rest of the world in many areas. Now, some companies around the world might have some pause because the U.S. still has not established its relations. Some banks might be very wary of going into Iran, still fearing that they might face some penalties from the United States. But remember, the rest of the world will be able to deal with Iran, and that'll be quite important. And I think that psychologically that will impact Iran tremendously. But also the other issue is that beyond the sanctions, Iran does have its own share of problems like many other developing economies, and that will naturally be a bit of a challenge as well.
And just lastly, you know, interestingly, the lifting of these sanctions coming at a time when oil prices are at an all-time low and dropped even further at the expectation of Iranian oil flooding back into the market. So what's going to happen to the oil prices, to the market, now that these sanctions have been lifted? Just how attractive is Iran's oil sector to foreign firms?
Well, that depends obviously on how long this downward trend will continue. I mean, given the substantial supply of Iranian oil that will go on stream for international markets as a result of this deal, that will only put more downward pressure. Now, obviously, other political events can impact that, but this is a critical issue for Iran itself, because Iran derives most of its foreign currency earnings from oil. And yes, it will be able to sell more oil, but the price of oil is substantially lower.
Farhad Alavi, lawyer who focuses on international business and sanctions, joining us from Washington, D.C. Great to have you with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Now,